everybody, it's Sharon here. Welcome back to my channel for those who are returning, and welcome to any new subscribers that may be visiting for the first time. So I have a little bit of a show and tell and discussion to have with you today about fabric dyeing. I've been following Susan Taylor Brown for some time now, and I've been joining in on her lives, which occur, well, for me it's every Thursday morning. And I just wanted to give Susan a huge shout out and thank you for the live videos that you've been doing. It's been a great way for people to network and to have discussions about different crafting topics, and I so enjoy starting my day off with your lives and the inspiration that you share with what you do and what we talk about. If you haven't been to visit during one of the lives, I honestly suggest that you do yourself a favor if you're creative in any way and pop over to Susan's live videos and enjoy the conversations that I had on a creative level, because they are so inspiring. As I said, I've been following Susan for some time now, and I've watched a couple of her videos from earlier days regarding fabric dyeing, and some of the videos that we've had, Susan's been working with some of her dyed fabrics, and I have been admiring her fabrics for some time now. There is something about the organic nature of her hand-dyed fabrics that I absolutely adore, and they've been calling out to me louder and louder and louder until I finally had to go and have a play for myself. Now, I've been dyeing papers for some time. I've been trying to come up with the perfect formula, I suppose, to get some different color ranges in papers, and I meant to grab some that I pre-dyed so that I could share with you. I'll just grab those, it won't be a moment. Okay, sorry about that. So I have here two particular colors. One is a blue and one is a yellow, and actually that one there is probably a better example. So I've mentioned before that I really love the softer tones, and I've been playing with some paper dyeing behind the scenes, trying to find that perfect representation of the kind of colors that I would really love to use in my journals. Initially, when I started making journals, I thought the tea dyeing or the coffee dyeing, I would be completely satisfied with that. I love neutrals. Didn't really think I would want to steer into colored papers, but the more I have been creating journals, the more I find myself wanting to incorporate more color. So I had a little play. Now, these were created using a tea stain with food dye added, and I was hoping I could find just the right balance by playing with the tea stain and food coloring to achieve the results I am after. And as much as I like these, like I don't hate them, I will use them, they just didn't quite hit the mark for me. So this is a blue, this is a yellow. I found the yellow really difficult to make it look yellow because the tea stain effectively has a yellowish tone. This is a better indication of the yellow that I was able to achieve. A lot of the papers that I did initially when I was trying the yellow came out looking tea stained. So I think I had to add a substantial amount of yellow to actually get a yellow result from memory. The blue, I had a little play because there is the yellow tone in the tea stain. The blue at one stage came out looking more green, so I had to add more blue to make it look more blue, if that makes sense. So suffice to say, for either choice, they didn't quite hit the mark for me. I love both. I love the way they've turned out, but it wasn't the result I was looking for. So I do have some other colors that I've played with. I sort of looked for these in a hurry, so I don't remember exactly where I've put the other two. I think I've used a green and a red that I've played with as well. So, and like I said, I will use these, but they just weren't exactly what I was hoping to achieve at the time. Okay, so inspired by a couple of Susan Taylor Brown's videos and by conversations that we'd had during her lives, I decided to have a play with some tea dyeing, and I have to tell you, I am so in love with my results and I cannot wait to share. So, little background information I wanted to share with you first. I've made myself some notes, so excuse me if I sound distracted. It's because I'm checking what I've written down. I didn't want to miss anything. So I've really only chosen, taken this out of my scrap basket. I've really only chosen 4 fabrics to dye. One is my ever beloved calico, and it has that slightly creamy tone to it. I have some cheesecloth that I purchased from Bargain Buyers here in Australia, and I love the rustic organic nature of that. And then I also have the cheesecloth fabric that I purchased from Spotlight. It is similar in the fact that it frays really, really well, and it is a fairly open weave, but it's more like a fabric than the cheaper version, and I absolutely love this fabric. If you've watched any of my collecting and gathering videos, you'll have seen that I've purchased it in quite a few different colors, but I thought it would take the dye really well, so I wanted to have a play with that. And it's just, I'm pretty sure this is the white option. There is a white and a cream, but I believe this is the white, so I used that. And then I also had this bed linen. It's a sheet that I purchased from Kmart, just in the Kmart brand, Anko I think the brand is called, and I think the sheets were like $8 a sheet. It's a single bed sheet, I believe, and I've been using this in my crafting for quite some time, and I love it because it's not really thick. It's quite a thin linen, and I've had a lot of success using it for layering and for snippet strips and snippet rolls and all sorts of things. And so again, it's not a really tight weave, and I thought it would take the dye quite well. So they were my 4 fabrics of choice. And now that I've shared that with you, stains that I've used, I used 2 different options. So one, I used herbal tea. I have a selection of herbal teas in my craft room that I have been collecting for quite a while with the hope of trialing them to tea stain some fabric. And I will say I did trial some in winter last year, and I did some herbal tea and some cabbage dyeing and really loved the results. But unfortunately, because the weather was quite cool and there was a lot of moisture in the air, the fabrics didn't dry as quickly as I'd hoped, even though I had them quite close to our fireplace to dry, which is our heat source in winter. They didn't dry quickly enough, and they ended up going moldy after just a couple of days, I think it was, of drying. And I was rotating them in the hope that it would dry them quicker, and it just didn't make a difference. So I decided I would wait until the warmer weather hit and try again. I will say the cabbage staining, I love the colours, but I didn't love the smell of the fabric once it was dyed. So I'm not really sure whether I will steer down that road again. I'll have to wait and see about that. But the colour tones that I achieved from the cabbage stain were kind of hitting the mark for me as far as how bright or how muted they were. In this case, they were a little bit more muted than bright, so that really appealed to me. So I've had a little play with some staining now, and I've used some Twinings herbal teas in different flavors. This is just one, so the mango and strawberry. And the other option I used for staining my fabric was this paint. Now, this is a Jo Sonia's paint brand, and I happened to be gifted a selection of these paints quite some time ago from a friend, and I haven't used them a whole lot, I will say. So it was kind of fun to play with them because color wise they really hit the mark for me, and I will definitely be playing some more with these. I have used other acrylic paints, and I'm getting ahead of myself now, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So I will say that the colour of these paints really hit the mark for me. And I did notice before I started this video that one lot of these paints are the acrylic gouache and the others are acrylics or matte fluid acrylics according to this. I don't know if in amongst the paints I have whether there are other options, perhaps just an acrylic as opposed to a matte fluid acrylic. But when I went looking, these were the two that stood out. So I didn't actually use this moss green. I used a different green, but I know that another one that I used was a gouache. So I wanted to point that out to you, that these were the paints that I used to do the dyeing. Now, before I go into my method and my observation, I wanted to show you the fabrics, because why not just cut straight to the chase and show you the result. So I have here the first set of fabrics, and I'm going to make sure I'm in camera properly. Oh, not too bad considering I couldn't see what I was doing. Now, I'm not going to open these out and flick through every individual piece of fabric. I just wanted to show you the overall results, and this one here was actually done using this skin tone base, and I will say it wasn't the first one that I did. And when I first pulled the fabrics out of the mix, I didn't think it had made a difference. Actually, I know what I did. Backtracking. So I had a piece of the cheaper, just grab my samples, the cheaper cheesecloth, and I put that into my mixture. Now, I will tell you, when I did the paint or gouache, I kind of followed videos that I'd watched of Susan Taylor Brown's, and I aimed for paint water. So, you know the kind of water that you have when you rinse off your paintbrush after painting, and it has a little bit of paint or a little bit of each of the paints that you've used, but it's not paint with a little bit of water, it's water with a little bit of paint, if that makes sense. So I ended up using, I had these plastic cups, which is what I used to mix the paint water in, and I did about 1/4 to 1/3 of distilled water. So I have what I used here. So this is just a black and gold brand, and I used about 1/3 to 1/4 of a cup, as in one of these cups, so about there, of water. And I literally just dropped in enough paint from my tube so that the paint would come out of the tube and drop into the cup without being squeezed really hard. And I probably did that maybe twice into the water. So if you can envisage the tiniest amount of paint coming out of this tube times 2, I would get an awful lot of fabric out of one tube of paint, I've decided. And with some of them I may have added extra. I know one lot of fabric I had a little play with using one color tone, and then I added a couple of different colored paints to that mix. I think that was the first lot that I did, and then a lot of them after that I decided to just play with the paint straight as it was, or I may have added one other color to either lighten or darken a tone. So I would get a lot of paper dyeing, or sorry, fabric dyeing out of one tube of paint. So that was how I made my mix. And all I did once I had it in my cup is I took a little craft stick and I just mixed the paint into the water so that it was saturated. I didn't want any lumps of paint in my water if I could get away with it. So that was how I mixed them. With the tea stain, I used about 1 to 1.5 cups of boiled water to 2 tea bags. So two of the same flavors, I'll call them, or colors in this case. So to 2 tea bags, and I left that to soak in the water. So I left the tea bags to soak in the water until the water was cooled or slightly cooled. It wasn't necessarily cold, but it wasn't boiling hot. Okay, so that was how I prepared my dyes. And once I did that, I took my fabrics. So I had individual piles of fabrics, and I think I took a photo. I don't know if the photo worked out very well, but if I find it worked out, I will show you the piles of fabrics that I had. I had just torn different sized fabrics from each of my fabric choices, and popped them into individual piles so that I could pick up a pile of fabric ready to go into whatever stain mix I had created. And I was kind of doing the tea staining at the same time as the paint staining. So I would mix up prepare my tea stain and leave that to soak while I went and mixed my paint. And then I would put my fabrics into the paint mixture and mix them in. And, oh sorry, I think I did the tea stain first. I popped my fabrics into the tea stain first because I wanted them to sit for a bit longer. They weren't as vibrant in colour, so I wasn't sure how the fabric would take the tea stain. So I wanted them to sit a little bit longer. And then I came back, while that was soaking, I came back and I popped my fabrics into the paint mix. Now, because my tea stain I mixed into a glass jug, so it's a 4-cup glass jug, much bigger in area, in space. So the fabric had lots of room to move and just soak up the tea stain. Because I was using these plastic cups for my paint fabrics, there was a lot less room in the cup. So I did have to work it quite a bit into the paint and water solution to make sure everything was covered. And when I took the individual pieces out, I did pop them in there and I did leave them to sit for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And every now and then I would work it in with the little craft stick just to really push the paint through the fabric. I did find when I started pulling the fabrics out that some of the fabrics were so tightly squeezed together that the water and paint had trouble penetrating through the whole fabric. So all I did when I found fabric like that was I opened it out and I just pressed it between my finger and thumbs, the areas that weren't actually hit with the paint and water solution, and that was enough to moisten the fabric with that paint solution, that I felt comfortable that that area had been covered. And it may not have been as what's the word, may not have been as saturated, but I knew it had been hit. So, and I will say that the calico was the fabric that I had to work the most with the paint and water solution, because it didn't actually take the paint and water as readily as I had hoped. I did actually wonder whether if I had wet the fabric with just water first, whether it would be more likely to take the paint and water solution, but I was kind of on a roll and what I was doing I felt was working, so I didn't want to risk it not working anymore, if that makes sense. I didn't want the water to stop the paint and water mixture from soaking into the fabric. So I decided I was on a good thing and I would just stick to it. So I did have to work the fabric a little bit as I was taking it out of the solution, but that was fine. I did end up with really messy hands, and for the results, totally worth it. So this is my skin tone result, and I didn't think it was really making a difference when I was pulling it out of the solution, when I did this first piece of cheesecloth, and I cannot tell you which one was first, the first piece I did, I actually ended up putting into the second mixture as well, because there were patches that, it was actually the first piece of fabric that I did. There were patches that didn't take at all. So I did a second dunking, whatever you'd like to say, with that particular piece of cheesecloth. But once it dried, I could see that it really did make a difference. And so I have pulled out these fabrics because I wanted to show you the comparison, because a cream is a much subtler or much more subtle color, and really the calico is a cream base. I wanted to show you that it really did make a difference. So that is the color comparison, and I love it. It's got a little bit of grunge. The grunge came about because of the way I dried it. So when I took the fabrics out of the paint mix or tea stain mix, I left them scrunched up in 2 balls. I had silver trays, which are just here. So I had these aluminium foil trays that I used to pop the fabrics in once they were tea stained, and these are the papers that I used. So just some baking paper that I folded up into squares, so I had 2 sets of colour in each tray. And I did the baking paper because I didn't want the colours to touch. I wanted to keep them separated. So that was where I sat them to dry, and I had the fabrics just scrunched up into balls, and I left them to dry, and where the creases were in the tops of the fabric, I ended up with really dark colouring or grungy colouring, and in some of the colours you'll see that is much more prominent than in the cream, but it did occur in the cream as well. And for me, that is the pattern. So I have wondered, if I laid the fabrics flat, whether I would end up with that same patterning in the final outcome, and I feel like there is a potential to end up with 2 quite different results. But I love that patterned look as opposed to a flat coloured result, if that makes sense. So I chose to dry them that way, and for me it takes the fabric to the next level as far as giving it a pattern without actually having a pattern, if that makes sense. So this is my skin toned result. And the other thing I wanted to tell you was that with both the tea stain and the paint solution, I had a leftover once I'd taken my fabrics out. So my fabrics, I sort of squeezed a little bit of the excess out, more so with the paint solution than I did with the tea stain solution, partly because the tea stain solution was a lot more saturated, and I was a little bit worried that if I squeezed too much of the liquid out, I would end up with very little colouring. So with the leftover paint or tea stain, in this case it's paint, I had a little play. Okay, so I'm hoping I've got this right. It appears that I had everything in order and I've shuffled them around slightly. So what I did was I coloured, stained if you like, some papers as well. So I have a little pile here of the cream. I didn't have a lot of this cream or skin coloured paint solution left, but I went ahead and coloured some papers, and it is very difficult to see that it's coloured, but you can definitely see on some of the papers. So here, for instance, you can see the white as well as the colouring. I'm really hoping that's showing okay in camera. And I ended up doing that with each of the fabric paints that I used, because, or stains that I used, because it was working and they were beautiful and I really, really love them. So out of the staining that I did, I've ended up with fabric sets and paper sets for each colour. What I will tell you with the paper staining is that I used an air drying method, and I had my leftover solution in my cup or in my glass jug, and I used this paintbrush. This is just it's a Monarch paintbrush that I picked up from Bunnings, I believe. I think it's about 25 millimeters from memory, because that tends to be my, yes, 25 millimeter or 2.5 centimeter brush, or 1 inch. That tends to be my go-to paintbrush size when I'm doing things. I've even painted my house using that size brush. I just love it. And so all I did was dunk my paintbrush, made it relatively saturated, and I just brushed it right across the page. When I first started doing it, I did the whole sheet, so I made sure there was no white space, and then I turned it over and I did the same, and on each page I may have dunked my paintbrush, you know, 2, 3, 4 times, however many I decided I needed to get a complete coverage. And you will see in some of the papers that I share coming up, you can really tell the difference between the two methods that I use. So that was the first method, where I painted over and had the whole thing covered on both front and back. Then I wondered if I could do it similarly to the way I do my tea staining, when I do my tea staining. And I've got some tea stain paper here somewhere where I've used that method that I'm talking about. And what it does is it gives an effect on one side of the paper. Sorry, oh, there's a tiny piece here. It gives an effect on the paper where you have some white or off-white coming through, and I actually really love that. It's kind of like, again, having a pattern without having a pattern. And when I have papers like that, I tend to use that side of the paper before I use the side that is completely saturated. So how I achieve that is I have a stack. So I'll start with one sheet of paper. I will completely cover one side as best I can without having any white showing, and then I will turn it over. I have a box that I use, and in that box, it's a relatively flat box. I think it's about that high, and it's quite large, and I use that to do my air dried tea staining in. In that box I have some plastic that I have attached to the box with bulldog clips or paper clips, like the big lever arch clips, sorry, to stop it from slipping around. And then I've layered some newspaper inside of that, and then I cover that with some baking paper. And the reason I cover it with the baking paper is so that I can remove the baking paper, and I can use the baking paper in my crafting if I wish to, once it's got lots of colour on it. So once I have my baking paper down, I pop my piece of paper down, completely cover one side with my stain mix. In this case, it was the watered paint solution, but in the past it's been my tea stain. And then I will turn it over and I will do exactly the same on the opposite side. And then I lay down my next sheet directly over the top of the last. And I just, before I do that, on the top of this first sheet, I will add extra stain. So I have a little bit of a pooling of the stain over the paper, so that when I lay my next sheet down over the top, like so, I try and line up my corners. All I do is stain one side of the paper. So I will give this side a complete saturation, and then again I will add additional staining so that I have pooling, and then I will add my next sheet. And I will continue to do that with each of the sheets. And that is how I end up with that really beautiful, so it's this side here, has the patchy white coming through, and I love it. When I first started doing it with the paint solution, I didn't consider that that would work. So what I did was I completely covered both sides. So did one side, turned it over, completely covered the next side, got my next sheet. I actually set that to the side, then I did my next sheet, sat that on top, and I worked that way. And then I started to wonder whether doing the paint solution would work the same as doing the tea stain solution, where I get that variegated white or off-white coming through the paint color, and it worked. So I did a little bit of both depending on how I was feeling at the time, and you'll see that in future papers. So I wanted to share that with you. So that's the papers and the fabrics in the skin tones. And when I was ironing these, so each set has been ironed. Initially I wasn't sure if I wanted to iron. The papers, particularly the paint ones, came out quite stiff. They felt very stiff to touch, and I was really nervous ironing them because I didn't know how the paint would react with my iron. I have a very cheap iron that I purchased from Kmart. I think the iron was about $15, and I use this iron just for my crafting. So I used the iron directly on the fabric, and I was a little bit nervous, and I went very tentatively, very carefully as I started to press the fabrics. I was worried that the paint might stick the fabric to the iron. So what I learned was it didn't stick. And once the fabric was pressed, it seemed to take it back to that slightly softer, more fabric feel, rather than the stiff, almost starched feel that it had before it was ironed. So that kind of made me go, okay, I know I can take it back to that softer feeling fabric consistency that I'm after. So I have to press each piece, which wasn't ideal, but it was quite satisfying knowing that it was making it really soft and more fabric-like again. So as I was ironing it, I found myself layering the fabrics. I had them sitting on my desk, and I would do the big pieces first and then work my way to the smaller pieces. And I kind of created myself my own little temporary artworks, and I absolutely love them. And it was just really fun. It was really fun to layer them. So when I did this, I had the word connected in my mind, and I was thinking about the events of last year with the you-know-what that we don't talk about, and how people were feeling disconnected and cut off and that sort of thing. And when I was layering these, what I was keeping in mind was I wanted to keep each piece connected to the piece underneath it in some way, but I wanted every separate piece of fabric to show through. And I managed to achieve that with each one. It took some doing, and you'll see that in some of the other piles that I have. The other thing was I had my larger pieces of fabric as the backing, and I didn't want to extend past the backing when I was layering pieces. Now this set here, my pieces of backing fabric were a little bit smaller, so I kind of extended that rule a little bit, if you like, when I did this particular piece. But a couple of the first pieces that I did, you'll see I didn't actually extend past the backing fabric. So before I show you the rest, I've decided I want to offer a challenge. One of the things that I really, really loved about doing this while I was ironing the fabric, and it didn't start out happening for any particular reason other than I think I'd laid a couple of pieces on top of each other, and I was like, oh, that's really fun. I'm having really fun, like, designing and layering them and seeing where I can take lines and the pieces, and it became a creative process, and it really distracted me from the fact that I was ironing each individual piece of fabric. So I found that really fun, but I found it really inspiring as well. So my challenge to everybody out there is to take supplies from your craft room, whether it be fabrics or papers. You could use scrap papers, you could use lots of different items, whether they be papers and fabrics, and I thought of paper clips and lots of different buttons and all sorts of things, and create yourself some temporary art. Now, the beauty of creating temporary art is that you can take a photo. So I've taken a photo of each of my pieces of temporary art, and I have a lasting memory of that temporary art. And then each of my pieces of fabric or whatever you use for your temporary art can go back to your crafting supplies to be used in other creative outlets. So I found it a really valuable way to feel like I was connecting to my resources, in this case my fabrics, and just touching and feeling and thinking about each piece of fabric individually and then as a collection was really inspiring. And I was thinking about all of the people out there who talk about having no mojo, or who've lost their mojo, or are really struggling creatively. And I was like, that could be a really fun exercise to try and get your mojo back. You're not wasting any resources. You're not creating anything that you think to yourself, I really don't like it at the end, so what am I going to do with it? Because it will all disassemble back into its homes that you have for it. But you get to play. So, I mean, you could use craft sticks. And so with that in mind, once you've chosen your resources of choice, the two words that I have in mind are disconnected and connected. And so when you are creating your temporary art, have those two words in mind. Use one or the other, or perhaps both. And I'm going to have a little bit more of a play with this challenge myself. I'd really love to try something with some scrap papers, and I'd really love to try something using multiple different resources. So I don't know when I'll get around to it. It may not be immediately because, as you know, I've not been videoing for some time. So I really want to get back into my crafting, but it may be a really fun thing to do on camera. I may even do it on camera on a weekend, for instance, and post a video doing my temporary art but without any sound, just so that you can see my process and know that that's what I'm doing. I think it will be a really, really fun way to help inspire me and to become familiar with different resources that I have, and to just see where I can take it with no strings attached, so to speak. Like I said, not using resources that I won't be able to use in my journals. I'm not using resources that I want to use for something else. I can use those resources, take a photo, keep a lasting memory, and pop them back into my supplies. So my challenge to everybody else out there is to have a go yourself. See what you can come up with. And I have created a hashtag. So I've got hashtag temporary art mojo booster dash paper and lace moments, or PALM. So paper and lace moments as an acronym is PALM, P-A-L-M. And so temporary art mojo booster dash PALM. If you use that hashtag, I will be able to see what you post, and I look forward to seeing what you create with your temporary art. So I think that's all the talking I had to do as far as that was concerned. I'm going to show you my other results. So this is my cream or skin toned fabric and paper set. And oops, and I've just realized I've picked up my temporary art. That's why, after all that talking, when I said they were disconnected, they shouldn't have been disconnected. So my backing is this piece of fabric and this piece of fabric, because I didn't have a large piece of fabric for this particular set to use that was large enough. I've used two separate ones, and then I've layered my fabrics on top of that to keep them connected and have a little piece of every piece of fabric showing. So that's my first set. Cannot believe that I didn't show that properly after all that talking. I'm not going to do a second take of that because I will have no idea where to start. Okay, so my next set is in this absolutely delicious blue. Just making sure I am in camera. And I love, love, love the tones of these blues. This was using the paint. And as you see, this is a set that I had the large piece of fabric to use as a backing. So again, I've layered all of my fabrics while I've been ironing them to be connected and to have a little piece of every fabric showing, which I believe I've managed to achieve. And I love the temporary art that I've created doing that. So fun. And then I have papers to show you that go with that. So these are the papers here, and I'll just flip you through a couple of them. I don't know which sets I did, so you can see the lighter color coming through. I don't know which sets I did complete coverage or which sets I did the layering effect, where I have just a saturated page and pop one sheet on top. So this sheet here, you can see I've pretty much covered the whole thing on both sides. I think this was my starting sheet actually, and then I have use that method with some of them, so I have a little bit of white coming through, and I love that. I love that effect. Now I will say, using the paint to colour the papers, I have fallen in love with staining paper with this method. It hit the mark for me as far as color tones and the actual color that I've used. And so my advice would be, if you're going to try this, and I did almost use a cheaper paint, and I knew that they would be in colors that I wasn't in love with. I think the key for me here is choosing the paint colors that I already loved. So that Jo Sonia's paint range, there were a lot of colors in there, including this moss green, which I haven't tried, but I would really love to try, that I looked at the color tone and I went, oh, I really love that. So I already knew that I loved the color tone. Unless you have cheaper paints and you want to try mixing your own colors, my advice would be that you're not necessarily going to get the results you're after if you haven't chosen the right color tone to suit your style. And that's what it comes down to, is hitting the mark with your style. So this was a huge learning curve for me. The other thing I really love is that the effect of the paint water on these papers is very much in keeping with the same staining effect that I get from a tea stain. It's not really saturated, it's not really bright, it's not really loud, and so I feel like I could pop that with a tea stain paper, which I'm just looking for, and I think they will be beautiful together in a journal. I'm so excited about this, you have no idea. So definitely managed to get results. I love The thing with air drying paper is that, or using the air dry method the way I do it, is that I do get some crinkling. I think that crinkling often comes from having it sitting on top of the baking paper. If you're not so keen on having those creases in your paper, using a flatter surface like perhaps a glass craft mat or a harder plastic surface, it may alleviate some of that creasing. I don't know for sure. I haven't tried anything other than the method that I've used, and I found when I do press them with the iron, although there's a slight texture, it's usually not too bad. The other thing is the pieces that are extreme in the creasing, if I use those for backings on journal cards or tags, I can generally press out the creases with the bone folder and the glue that's on the back to get a smooth surface. So I don't worry about it as much as I did when I first started using that method. But so you can see this one isn't creased anywhere near as much, so it would be fabulous for a journal page. So that is the blue, and that was using the Jo Sonja's paint. Now I'd really love to be able to tell you what paint I used in which combination of colors. I'm not able to do that because I wasn't taking notes while I was experimenting. I was just caught up in the moment of experimenting. The blues, I think I only used one color, but again, I'm not able to guarantee. In actual fact, I think I added a little bit of black to deepen the tone of the paint that I used. So potentially I'll never be able to achieve the colors again that I show you right now, but I think that will be part of the fun too, is coming up with similar color tones but slightly different. So they are the blue and the temporary art, again fitting in with the challenge that I have just given you all. I'm excited to see what you can all create. Okay, and then I have one of my tea stained fabric sets, or tea stained temporary art sets, and this particular set here I believe is, oh, the other thing I needed to show you was I had a little bit of paint left over in my cup at the end of each session, so I used it to also colour some paper towel and some baby wipes. What I did learn when ironing was that you cannot iron a baby wipe. I didn't know that beforehand, but it kind of stuck. The first one that I ironed stuck to my iron, so I haven't ironed any of the others. I've also learned that my baby wipes have a pattern and print on them, so I don't know how that will translate into using them in any of my crafting, but I'm excited to give that a go. I haven't really used baby wipes before in my crafting, so I decided I would use some of the leftovers to stain and see what I could do with that. So I have some of those with most of the colors that I've done. So that was the blue one. Okay, so this was using the Twinings Orange and Cinnamon. The other thing I wanted to mention was that the fabrics that were dyed with the tea did have a lovely fragrance when they were first dyed. I haven't actually, I can't tell you whether they still have the same fragrance now. It was quite prominent actually when I was ironing them. The heat really released that fragrance, so that was really lovely. It kind of reminded me of the old scratch and sniff papers that we used to get years ago. So I love that grungy patterned look that I've achieved just by air drying it. And with my temporary art, you can see I've got the large piece at the back, and I've actually ruffled this piece of fabric here because it was longer than my backing piece. So that's what I was saying. I tried to stick within the confines of the largest piece of fabric where it was a decent size. And I've just layered the fabric, or I think with the blue set, I had some long thin strips and I folded those in half. So this one here is the same. So you can see where it's folded here. I've just folded that in half so that it stays within the confines. So I'd really love it if you have a go at the challenge and see what you can come up with. And so the tea stain papers that go with that are here. And the tea staining papers are not anywhere near as vibrant. And I did wonder whether I should have perhaps used a third tea bag to get a more vibrant colour. But having said that, I love the subtleness of them. So it's not an overly vibrant colour. I'm just looking to see if I have some white paper to show you the colour difference. So I have here a piece of white paper, the same paper that I've used, and I will tell you that I ended up using reflex white copy paper, and it's a very subtle colour difference, but it is there. So I've decided that if I did it again, I probably wouldn't add extra. A lot of the colour I feel like would have come out into the fabric, and I was just using up the leftovers basically to use them up. So I'm really happy with the results. Again, I love the way they kind of work together between the acrylic paint sets and the tea staining, and some of the papers are more vibrant than others. I'm just really happy with the results. So I'm not sure if you could see that, just a general flip through. Subtle but beautiful. Okay, so that is the orange and cinnamon. These threads here too, I should mention, when I prepared my fabrics, I tore them into the strips or sizes that I wanted, and I didn't fray anything before staining. And so when I ironed them, I had, some of them were quite a matted mess, and I took away the additional threads then, and that's how I've ended up with this pile of threads for each set. It was a little bit more work, I feel like, to do it that way because they were quite matted. The ones that I did with the paint have a stiffness about them because I pulled the threads away before I actually pressed the fabric, and towards the end of the pressing I realized that if I press the threads, that application of heat does soften the threads as well. So I may go back and just touch them gently with the iron to release the fabric from being so stiff. So I'm going to show you here, I have 3 sets of fabrics here, and 2 are paint stained and 1 is tea stained, and I just feel like they work so beautifully together. I love them. Love, 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 love. I need some in every colour now, and I haven't picked up my temporary art properly for the bottom. Actually, I might sit that on top, I think. It's just easier to pick up when there's a complete piece of fabric at the bottom. Okay, my next one, playing with neutrals. Now, this was actually the last of the browns that I did. The first 2 were much lighter, and I'll explain more about those when I pull them out to show you. I need to check that I'm in camera. This was a darker brown paint that I had, so it's not because I've mixed colour, it was the colour that the paint was. And I really loved the richness of it, and I actually was a little bit worried that it would be too dark, but because the paint was so saturated with water, I've still ended up with a relatively muted colour palette, I suppose you could say, and I love, 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 love that that's how it's turned out. And I think that's been my greatest observation or discovery while doing this, is that I can have a really dark colour and still end up with quite a soft, muted result. So I'm excited to have a play. I've actually got a black, and I'm excited to have a play with the black to see what results, because I feel like I will end up with a black colour, but it will still have that muted, I don't know how else to explain it. It's not like it's going to come out jet black and that's all you see. There'll be variations in the colour, and that's what I really love about this method. So, and then, oops, and I've done it again. I've forgotten to show you the, so these are the paper towels and wipes for the orange. I mean, you can see those against those fabrics, how beautiful they are. Love, love, love. So yes, they were for the orange papers. Okay, so I was just about to pull the papers for this set. So here we have the baby wipes and the paper towel. I didn't have a whole lot of water left over for the paper towel because I got a bit carried away doing the papers. I was really loving the results, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. So I'll just set those to the side and I'll flip you through. So you can see I have a lot less colour on the back there. I think some of these I completely painted. So this may have been a set where I completely painted and then did a little bit of the, yes, so you can see there, that's quite prominent between the white and the painted areas, and I love it. I love that it's not completely covered. I just find it really, really interesting. So you can see the contrast between the two, completely covered and just patches. And on a journal, in a journal, as a journal page, to have the two, I just think it's so interesting. Love, love, love. This is going to become my favorite way of coloring papers for a journal. I can see it now. I'm already imagining all sorts of color options and a lot more sessions of dyeing fabrics and papers in the future. Okay, so I'm going to have to leave it there. I've realized that I am going to have to split my video into two. I really hope that you've enjoyed watching part one of my fabric and paper shares using the method that has been inspired by Susan Taylor Brown. And again, I really wanted to extend a huge thank you to Susan Taylor Brown for everything that you do and everything that you share, and for always inspiring. I look forward to seeing you all soon, everybody. Please stay safe, stay inspired, and happy crafting. Bye for now.